Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone to Northern Institute's Social and Policy Research Platter for CDU Research Week 2020. My name is Katrina Britnell and I'm the Partnerships Coordinator with Northern Institute. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. For us at Northern Institute in Darwin, it is the Larrakia we pay our respects to. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us online today. Please keep your microphones muted if they're not already, and if you would like to ask any questions, you'll be asked at the end of the webinar to do so, just so it's all in one place. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr Tracy Woodroffe, who is a researcher and lecturer at CDU on her research Indigenous women in STEM, in science. And take it away, Tracy.
Thanks, Katrina. Hey, everyone. I'm just going to have a quick chat first and then I'm going to share a screen with you of my PowerPoint presentation for today. So just quickly, I would like to say what we're going to talk about. So what I'm going to do is just tell you that the focus of the presentation today is a publication, and it's written by myself plus my colleagues who were working on this project together. So Dr. Anne Lau, Dr. Larapa Maipalama and also Dr. Kelly Pollard. So the work that we did together has been compiled into a publication, and that's how I'm going to work through my presentation today. So thank you very much. And I will share my screen with you. The title of the publication is Indigenous Women in Science, a Framework for Leadership, Knowledge, Innovation and Complexity. Now, even though it says science, the project itself was funded by WISE funding, so Women in STEM and Entrepreneurship. And that enabled us to get together and conduct a series of workshops with majority Indigenous women, the focus of which was to really draw out Indigenous voice in that space of inclusion into higher education. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So the flow of today's presentation is going to be first just to skim the article to get the main context out of the abstract, and then I'll go through the key headings and then pull out the conclusion for you finally. So the main focus of the information or the data collection was actually a series of workshops, and I'll go into more detail about those workshops. And then the findings was about what kind of concepts or themes are really prominent or very important when Indigenous people are thinking about engaging with higher education, but also there's kind of recommendations about implementing some steps or processes that can make that a more respectful process for Indigenous and non-Indigenous together, and to be recognising that equal footing in participation. So this is the abstract, and I posted it for the presentation, so you may have already read it, but mainly the idea that we're trying to unpack in more detail is this dual academy approach to higher education for Indigenous people. So one that might be similar to the approach taken in New Zealand, perhaps, where they have a bicultural representation within their education system at least, and it recognises non-Indigenous or Western systems and ideas about education, but also non-Indigenous systems of education, and perhaps, you know, you might say non-Indigenous knowledge systems, and where those two could possibly overlap. So where do we see the synthesis or the synergies that allow this respectful and effective participation for Indigenous people? So Indigenous engagement in tertiary education has been a point of contention in Australia for many years. Yes, it has, okay? And really what brought that sharply into view was the Behrendt review for 2012. It talked about parity in participation for Indigenous people, and what that talks about is the percentage of Indigenous people in a population and seeing that represented, so that parity shown in engagement and success, I suppose, within an education system. So one that acknowledges and includes Indigenous peoples. So what we did to explore the dual academy concept in more detail was to organise a series of workshops. And in organising those workshops, we had to also incorporate a way of acknowledging and recognising diversity in Indigenous culture. So one way of doing that was in thinking about geographic location. So we included an urban centre, which was Darwin, a regional hub, which was Alice Springs, and then an Indigenous community, which was Galiwin'ku. So there were 3 workshops, and what we found was this rich and powerful engagement of Indigenous people already with higher education, but perhaps not an acknowledgement or a recognition of that within a Western framing of success or achievement. So the combined knowledge addressed diverse areas of science. So science was a focus that we took in particular, and included in that is the science of education design. And the participants had expertise ranging from midwifery, educational design, linguistics, drone piloting, and more. There was more, so much more. For example, archaeology as well. I know Dr. Pollard's joined us in our group here together. So after listening to the participants and their messages, a list of considerations was developed, as well as an emerging implementation framework requiring further testing. So we understand that we've only sort of initiated the first steps of possible research into the space, and that there's more to be done. So key headings of interest. Within the article, key headings that came out were Indigenous diversity, of course, the data and the results. But then we had participants who volunteered their stories as vignettes, which is an important aspect in our article. And then we discussed some limitations and assumptions that came out. And finally, we finish with conclusions, and we make sure to shape the Indigenous significance in the conclusions that were drawn. So diversity, Indigenous diversity is one of the key themes. Like I discussed already, it was important to have particular geographic locations represented within our workshops, so that we could get a spread of ideas and input and information, and not all be blanketed under the one term of Indigenous, as if we all think in one way and all have one brain and one aspiration. We don't, okay? And geographic locations, very different. And when you look at the input from each of those locations, you'll see there were some areas of overlap, but there were also some definite topics or themes that were more important in different areas. Okay, so the information collected highlighted the complexity of innovation that's required to realise equity in higher education in the Northern Territory, let alone Australia. And conversations were about recognising Indigenous knowledge as comparable, compatible and valuable to what's learnt in Western education. So with the focus on higher ed. And I keep referring to this Western education because our Australian education system is a Westernised system, and that's the frame that we all have to currently fit within. So most participants were Indigenous women, and really that was to hear Indigenous voice and perspectives in the space and from Indigenous women in particular. So the data and results. So what happened was during each of the workshops, conversations and thinking was recorded by participants and also workshop presenters. So notes were taken and people were asked if they would like their notes to be included in input, and so everyone could feel that they had an opportunity to participate in the research to the degree that they wanted to, and also if they felt the need also to contribute to the publication. So this information was analysed using a thematic approach to reveal central relevant themes, and these themes from the workshops highlighted numerous considerations. But it also highlighted the need for more research to occur, which I've already alluded to, into how to overcome some of the barriers. Okay, so there were barriers that were mentioned that have limited Indigenous participation to date. So bringing those to light means that we can think of strategies for how to effectively manoeuvre past those. The participant vignettes, so there were 4 vignettes that were volunteered by participants, and I haven't edited those. Those are completely in the words and from the perspective and positioning of those participants and the way that they have written and worded the vignettes themselves. So Australian Aboriginal Studies, Brilliant Indigenous Genius Then and Now, Caring for Mum on Country, which is a project, Aboriginal English, Language, Culture, Identity and Learning, and also an Indigenous Student Perspective. So we're very lucky to have those vignettes to be able to support the findings of the research and to also further unpack what the participants really wanted to discuss in this topic of a dual academy approach to higher education. Obviously, within research, you also have to identify what any possible limitations are, and some of the key assumptions that should be clearly understood when you are conveying what the research scope involved. So first I've unpacked some assumptions, and then I've named one of the main limitations of the actual dual academy workshop approach that we took already. So there's the assumption that all Indigenous people know what higher education is, understand the process and requirements for admission, and the relevance of participating. Okay, so that's a main assumption. There's the assumption that Indigenous people operate within Western knowledge systems and that they leave their own culture at the door. Not true. There's an assumption that we all share the same opinions and goals with regards to education. Another assumption, okay? So those kind of were in the foreground of our thinking and our discussions when considering what may have led to the process of us needing to have these workshops to discuss an alternative approach to higher ed. Why would we need to? Because there are those existing assumptions about Indigenous people and Indigenous engagement in higher ed. So reflecting then on our project and the process of what we were doing, the main limitation of the project was the concept of, a dual academy approach. Revealed itself to be quite complex and requiring innovation and further investigation. So, you know, really what it did was it showed that, okay, so we found out these particular things, and then what now? So there still needs to be more exploration and investigation done. Conclusions and Indigenous significance. Achieving a dual academy approach to higher education will need to be one that both acknowledges Indigenous knowledge as valid and credible, and that is flexible enough to recognise and embrace the diversity of Indigenous culture in the Northern Territory and Australia. Geographic location impacts on access and engagement with higher education. That last sentence is probably one of the more difficult concepts for people to grasp, especially people from larger urban centres who may not understand the Northern Territory context in the detail that we do. So quite a revealing statement, that last one. So what came out of it when we did our thematic analysis were considerations of a dual academy approach in table 1. So first of all, if we're thinking about Indigenous women with Indigenous knowledge, we all have to operate within a Western education system, and the focus is on content and scientific method implementation. But then if you compare the different knowledge systems, you'll see that for Indigenous people, the location that they study in, the preference is on country, whereas Western knowledge, the preference is that everyone comes to the university. With Indigenous knowledge, important for us, central to whatever we do, family, language and culture. In Western knowledge, this idea of studying, the academy is central to what you're doing. With Indigenous people, we have very big range of diversity. Within Western knowledge and studying at university, it's monolingual and to a degree monocultural. If you think that we're all working within that Western frame and Western ideas of what is knowledge and what knowledge should be known. Indigenous knowledge, again, we're looking at Indigenous languages and Indigenous academic language that does not necessarily directly translate into English, which is the language of our education system, standard Australian English, and then that level of academic language within that, and processes and formatting and established or expected behaviours within that. So if we're considering Indigenous knowledge, again, there's a continuation of culture as an end goal. There's this communal celebration or idea of the point of education and for the purpose of continuing culture, whereas in Western knowledge, it's more of an individualised process for the individual to receive their piece of paper at the end, their academic achievement. So you could think of how are we going to make it so that we have this dual academy system where each of these knowledge systems and the resulting themes can be accommodated within them. You know, it is a challenge, it is complex, it does require innovation, and we're not there yet. So the second part of what came out of the themes and the findings of the research was that we could group key concepts and try and discover or reveal a possible framework where we could begin to envision a dual academy approach. So if we're thinking of knowledge informing curriculum within that, we might try incorporating both Indigenous and Western knowledge systems equally while respecting and acknowledging intellectual property. Thinking about the location mode of learning delivery, okay? So face-to-face delivery of learning is provided to Indigenous students if that's what they prefer, because that was put forward as a preference. Language, you have to consider the language used, okay? Both Indigenous languages and standard Australian English would need to be accepted as measures of intellect and academic achievement. Assessment would need to be designed to accommodate this. How might you do that? You know, you would like to think that our systems are flexible, but it's not necessarily the case. Educators informing pedagogy. So if we think about how academics inform pedagogy, if we're thinking of a dual or considering a dual academy approach, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators would need to work together to deliver learning. Indigenous educators would have to be acknowledged as expert in their own knowledge and employed at levels that reflect this expertise. If there's anything that stands out within our education system, it's the respect afforded depending on your salary scale. And then finally, achievement. So within that dual academy, how would we recognise achievement? So you would need to make sure that it was recognised as both achievement for an individual and for the community and continuation of culture. And that is the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, can you please make sure they're in the chat section? That's right. And Katrina will be compiling those for me so we can, are we going to have a bit of a Q&A, Katrina?
We are going to have a Q&A. Thank you for that.
Okay.
So the first question comes from Dr. Kelly Pollard.
Yep.
And she says, the assumptions you identified are universal, I think, across the disciplines. How can we tackle this? And just continuing, and the issue of legitimacy of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing you spoke of is a priority for decolonising Western higher education spaces, and new intellectual spaces need to be made, and the spaces where the dual academy could be located. So just going back to the first part of that, the assumptions you identified are universal, I think, across the disciplines. How can we tackle this?
Okay, so Dr. Kelly Pollard, I'm so glad you asked me that one, because I have an approach that I would like to initiate, and I think that we could probably begin it here in the Northern Territory with a little bit of a revolution and start advocating for an education treaty. So we would have equal rights and equal footing similar to that provides that dual cultural footing and approach to people in New Zealand based on their Waitangi Treaty. So I would propose an education treaty and try to make that a national initiative that we could then feel like we at least have equal footing to implement our innovations for a dual academy approach.
Excellent, thanks Tracy. And the next question we have is from Catherine Hancock. How can we inspire Western education to shift towards the collectivism model of Indigenous cultures? Which may have answered that. And she says, I feel we are constantly looking to pull people towards our way rather than shifting ourselves towards their way.
Okay, so really what we need is a transformative approach. So we're trying to bring on board people, and the only way you do that is by changing bias and attitudes. It's not easy, and if people are going to be kicking and screaming, you just can't drag them along. I think if we were in more of a position where we had a recognised equal footing, it would make that much easier. And in the Northern Territory, with our greater percentage of Indigenous population, I see us as an ideal place to begin that journey and to create perhaps an excellence in higher education here and use the Dual Academy as a showcase or example of excellence.
Thanks, Tracy. The last question we have is from Sarah Ireland. Where can we access or get a copy of your paper?
Thank you, Dr. Sarah Ireland. Okay, we are nearly at the stage where we are submitting. I submitted the paper to Taylor and Francis editing service and they returned it to me. So we're in the final stages of preparing it for a particular journal, and when I have finally submitted, I will notify everyone who has been involved in the workshops and especially those that contributed to the publication to let you know that it's in and we're waiting to hear back. But fantastic effort actually, and once that publication is published, it will be an impetus for the next stage in any of the research that we can do.
And we will certainly be sharing when it is published across Northern Institute and our social media channels. And just so you know that this webinar is recorded and it will be edited and uploaded to our Vimeo channel and to our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out on our social media because we will post when it is uploaded for viewing. So I think that's it, Tracy. Thank you so much for joining us today and for presenting for CDU Research Week. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'd really like to thank everyone who joined the session as well. Thanks so much.